So we put together, I think, a very interesting panel because there are people here who come from different perspectives. And I think we're going to start with Daniel. And
yours isn't working.
Thank you, that was very good. Now I have Daniel's really long bio here, so I hope you're all comfortable. Daniel Perell has been with the Baha'i international community as a representative to the UN for 5 years. He's been able to cover almost all issues that his office works on at the UN, including development, human rights, the advancement of women, and the role of religion in society. That was all of it. Thank you, Daniel.
Hey, welcome.
Don't applaud before I speak. You may come to regret it. Also, I didn't know there were still nameless countries. I thought all countries had names. Anyhow. So, as I was thinking about this, I was trying to understand how I conceive of spirituality and whether or not it should be distinguished from religiosity and all of this. But to my mind, there are the way that I understand it is as sort of the spiritual dimension of human life. So there's a material and a physical dimension to human life, but there's also a dimension that encompasses things like meaning and justice, love and conscience, an idea that's more transcendent in our lives. But both of these systems apply to the same and describe the same reality. There's a scientifically motivated reason for justice. There's also a spiritually motivated reason for justice. So when we think of the United Nations more specifically, of the journey that humanity had to traverse to get to the point of its existence, the universal visionary spirit of the founders of the UN and the drafters of its declaration, the spiritual dimension of human life, the longing for peace and for justice, for virtues, comes into plain view. So I'll use an example, and that's the drafting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And just as an aside, I'm not going to talk very much about what I do or what my organization does. I'll let Rick speak on my behalf for that, if you would like. Anyhow, in the drafting of the UDHR, it was not a dry, technocratic engagement. It was 2 years where the United Nations Commission on Human Rights deliberated and delved deeply into ideas as wide-ranging as Confucian philosophy and Christianity and Islam and Judaism, Hinduism, into diverse schools of philosophy, sociology, and jurisprudence. Many philosophers, writers, scholars, theologians all contributed their ideas to the Commission in the course of the drafting process. One example is the story of P.C. Chang. Do you know P.C. Chang? Okay, great. Otherwise, you would know if I'm lying.
We know that you wouldn't do that.
Well, hopefully. So anyhow, the Chinese philosopher P.C. Chang, he was a diplomat. He served as the vice chair of the Commission of Human Rights and was among the main contributors to the content and the articulation of the declaration. He had tried to bring various Confucian concepts into the UDHR. And there's a story in particular about the wording of Article 1. Article 1 of the Declaration states, "All men are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with dignity and conscience and should regard each other in the spirit of brotherhood." But in some earlier versions, there was no mention of conscience. They were simply endowed with reason. But Chang had suggested that reason alone was inadequate. He suggested that Article 1 should include another concept, the concept of ren, drawn from Confucian moral philosophy. It's written using the Chinese character for human in conjunction with a character for the number 2. Chang translated this concept into English as two-men-mindedness. Two-men-mindedness. For all intents and purposes, it was the equivalent of conscience. So that ended up in there. So the UDHR is among the most translated documents ever produced. Eleanor Roosevelt, the convener and first chairwoman of the commission, said that it may well become the international Magna Carta of all men everywhere. And it had staying power. It's, of course, still exists, but in his address to the UN in October of '95, Pope John Paul II called the Declaration one of the highest expressions of the human conscience of our time. Is that word, conscience? So as a Baha'i, I see the growth in unity and solidarity of the peoples and nations of the world as one of the most powerful expressions of the spiritual dimension of human life within the UN. We should look at the creation of the United Nations in the context of the history of the human race, in order to fully appreciate the spiritual as well as the political significance of the act of creating the organization. It's really easy to say what doesn't work at the UN, But when has a human undertaking of this magnitude of the creation of a global deliberating body with universal membership started in its perfect form? We need only look to the challenges that led to the eventual failure of the League of Nations. It lasted for 26 years, and at its height it had 58 members. Now we are celebrating the 70th anniversary of the UN, and the membership is now 193 nations, and it continues to grow. Of course, the arc of progress is not smooth. The language that P.C. Chang used 70 years ago may seem out of place in the modern conversation. And yet, through the lens of unity, we can see tremendous progress. The idea of global solidarity is almost a given in almost any field of human endeavor now. This drive towards unity and solidarity has been among the defining features of the 20th and 21st centuries. When before had an injustice anywhere been conceived as a threat to justice everywhere? The implications of that are global, literally. When before had the norm been to encounter those who are of different races, religions, ages, nationalities in a spirit of fellowship? This is the norm. We may hear a lot about all of the exceptions. That's because the norm is not maybe newsworthy. And look at yourselves. I mean, I'm sure all of you in your daily interactions don't encounter someone of a different race or age and think, ugh, that's not normal any longer. Now, this is not to deny the fractured states and regions, the conflicts, the partisanship that dominate the media, especially, and the global discourse to some degree. These are real, and in many cases, they're the expressions of masses of people rising up against forces of injustice and oppression. We must, however, acknowledge that the idea of one world, one planet, one human race, one global community is an idea that has gained tremendous traction and now finds expression in every facet of human life. We experience more and more events as one global community, understanding that no crisis exists out there, at least not for any real length of time. Whether it's financial crises or migration or climate change, violence against women, something that may seem very domestic, it has implications for all of us, regardless of whether or not we experience it directly. So this deep longing for peace expressed by people for hundreds, if not thousands of years, is finding expression now in a longing for unity, for solidarity and justice. The end of the Cold War was a tremendously spiritual moment. It gave rise to these major conferences of the 1990s, which then gave rise to anniversary conferences like Rio Plus 20. And Rio Plus 20 gave rise to Agenda 2030, the first ever truly global development agenda. Now, just as a quick comparison to the MDGs, I think we all know this, but one way that I see as the quintessential difference is reflective of how we understand development generally. Development once was seen as what I do for you. And that's how the MDGs were constructed. What do we, the, quote, developed countries, do for them, the, quote, undeveloped or developing countries? It's no longer seen that way, at least in discourse. In discourse, we recognize that there's a unity, and we have to engage in this together. Now, how to apply that is different. I can talk about building an airplane, and I know some of the physics involved. That doesn't mean I can do it. So we are going through stages of understanding. But it's the spiritual connection that binds us, that compels us to come together as larger and larger units of society, starting with the family, with the tribe, the nation state, and now we conceive of ourselves as one global family. So this is actually the pivotal principle of the Baha'i faith, this oneness. All of the teachings of my religion, though I was not born into this religion actually, are put in place to support the construction of a global community that reflects this principle. The reason I call out that I wasn't born into this religion is that we now, again, are more open to searching out new things and finding new horizons that can speak to us more accurately. Anyhow, some of the principles of this religion are the abolition of all forms of prejudice, the harmony between religion and science, equality of men and women, compulsory education, adoption of a universal auxiliary language. That's auxiliary, that's not the primary. The abolition of the extremes of wealth and poverty, institution of a world tribunal, and confirmation of justice as the ruling principle in human affairs. And I would actually add unity as well. Justice and unity are not always the same thing. If you remove someone from society in the name of justice, it may not be building unity within his or her family or community. But all of these principles, they're not statements of vague aspiration. They're matters of real concern. They all in various ways find expression in the work of the UN. And the idea that these are not vague is quite important to the work that I do. And I'll make a final plea to all of us in the room, because this is how I conceive of my work. Pushing a spiritual agenda has often been conceived as something soft, something we don't have language to describe, something that's other, something that's immeasurable. But I would suggest that it's not entirely immeasurable or indescribable. Gravity at one point was something we couldn't describe. We could see it acting. We didn't know the language, the words to figure out what gravity really was. But through rigor and scientific questioning, curiosity, we were able to outline some laws that describe gravity. And now this invisible force that puts my pen on the table is something that we all know and understand very simply. But why isn't that the same for spirituality? Why haven't we gone through that same kind of rigor to describe the benefits of a group coming together? Sorry, I just got a text, of course. This is modern technology, right? So what would it look like to do the same for spirituality? You know, a group coming together to speak on issues of concern from diverse perspectives versus a group coming together to speak on issues of concern from one perspective. We can measure a difference there, and I would argue that that may be a spiritual difference. I was just across the street in an expert group meeting on social development, and one of the presenters was talking about the limits of data. She gave a very sad example, so I'll counterbalance it also with a happy example, so don't fret too much. She told the story of a disabled woman who, upon the death of her parents, was kicked out of her house by her brother. Her brother said that he was ashamed to have her in the house. And so he agreed to give her food and to set up a thatch 6-foot by 8-foot room in the backyard where she could live. And he would cover her health care and things like that. So technically, as far as the data is concerned, she's housed and she's fed. And she has access to some degree of care. However, she was quoted as saying, essentially, I'm dirty, I'm worthless, I'm not appreciated, all I want to know is how I can die. The data doesn't measure that. On the other hand, we can see some good things, though. We know that there are studies out there on behavioral economics that demonstrate that having a woman in leadership has a profound effect on the psyche of men and women alike. So you know those studies where you have a scientific paper written by Jane Doe or John Doe, and you ask people to measure the reliability of the study? John Doe almost always wins. But in India, where they recently instituted a rule on the number of women in governance, they found that after 7 years, we don't know why the number is 7 years, but after 7 years, that kind of confirmation bias goes away for men. That's amazing. That's a profound spiritual shift that we don't understand. But if we study it, if we understand it, that to me is actually the strongest reason for a woman Secretary General. I don't care that there hasn't been one, and I don't care that we need gender parity. That's all great, and I agree with it. But that's not enough. What's enough is how it will change the hearts and minds of young men and young women everywhere. I've gone way off my script. So now the question is there any way that we can measure dignity? Can we talk about this in ways that have meaning? And one of the things that my office tries to do is articulate and read what's happening at the UN with more spiritual texts, more of a nuanced understanding, not just quantitative but also qualitative, and tries to contribute to it. And we can actually even look at the creation of the SDGs as an example of it. We had people from all over the world, 8 million individuals, who just registered online to share their perspective. That doesn't include all the other ways in which people were contributing. And we had a universal goal of creating a whole new agenda that could be agreed upon by all. The enemy was not within, it was something existential. The enemy being the articulation of a set of goals for the whole world. And our progress in getting to that was a very spiritual experience. And I'm sure Rick will discuss that because he's done a lot of work on it. So we could actually analyze the creation of the SDGs through a spiritual lens, as well as through a more material one. So I think I've taken quite enough of your time, but I will end with a quote from the Baha'i faith, which is that the well-being of mankind, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established.
Thank you, Daniel. And after we're gone through the panel, we'll have time for questions and conversation after that. I picked up on two things that you said, one right near the end when you talked about how it took 7 years for that change to happen in India. And in the Jewish faith, the number 7 is very powerful because it is the number of creation. And that's exactly what began in that program in India. Suddenly there was a creation of a new thought pattern that allowed for a change in who was represented by whom, which is so powerful. And getting back to the depth of the beginning of the spiritual goal of this, Doug Hammarskjöld creating the meditation room and creating that block of mineral, which was the same material out of which weapons were forged, but in its nascent state, as a rectangular block of metal, it could just as easily been the material for peace. It had no character until we gave it character. And as long as we can remember that it's about peace and it's about growth and it's about sharing, and Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first High Commissioner for Human Rights at the UN, she supported those universal values and equality that is in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the part that she focused on was that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Sounds a lot like what you said. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act toward one another in the spirit of brotherhood. The only thing I would change in that is in the spirit of humanity. There's too much brother in all of the literature, and women aren't heard because they aren't recognized. So we need to change some of the language too, and that's, I think, part of what we all do, is relanguaging this UN to get something out of it that's positive for everybody on an equal basis at all times.